Bilibili in China when it eventually comes out. So, in fact, most of our audiences are in China. Okay, great.
So I sent you, I talked briefly with each one of you in different capacities. The discussions were no different. And so trying to keep it relatively open-ended. I'll give a brief introduction, and maybe Neil, I'll pass it to you to put it in context of some of the broader things that you're doing for the overall conference, and then we can just get right into it. We have an hour to 2 hours to talk, and I will, in a way, defer to you to when you think you've sucked the juice out of this. So we'll go from there. Does that sound good?
Fantastic.
Great. So it's a great pleasure to host this event. We have Neil Leach, who's organizing the overall conference from FIU in Shanghai and many other places. We're joined by Eva Berman, who's the Dean at the University of Virginia, Hashim Sarkis, the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, Eva Franchi, the Director at the Architectural Association, and myself in the capacity of a Dean at Cooper Union. Neil, why don't you try to position this particular panel in the context of some of the larger goals you're trying to achieve, and then we can take a deep dive.
Yes. So let me just simply say that we have alongside this a series of workshops happening, but we wanted to introduce some debates about the condition in which we find ourselves right now, a very novel situation to address basically architecture and urbanism in the age of COVID-19. And in many ways, what's happening now, this online conversation, is a product of that. And what it is doing, actually, in an interesting kind of way, these kind of Zoom links, is we're bringing together people from across the globe in a new configuration to debate issues that affect us. And I think the question of the university for all of us is clearly something highly topical, because we're no longer there in the physical buildings, and we are relying upon the domain of the digital to create our academic environment. I think that, to my mind, the question is, as we get sort of shaken out of our traditional ways of thinking about things and began to realize that maybe we could do this anyway in the first place. We could be ordering our groceries online, we could have contactless payment, and we could have conversations across the world remotely through Zoom. We might start developing different practices and traditions that reinvent how we operate. And it seems to me that one thing we really have to reinvent is how the university operates, especially with the threat of COVID-19 still there, and the possibility of losing the face-to-face operation. And it seems to me that it raises a lot of important questions that we've taken for granted, or issues we've taken for granted, about how we should operate. And I think there's going to be a new form of operation. And I think this is what this panel is about, is to try and rethink the possibilities of what constitute the university, what might constitute education in the age of COVID-19. So I'm very grateful for having you all here. It's a fantastic lineup.
Thank you, Neil. And you know, there is a compulsion to talk immediately about the chaotic and turbulent times we're all going through. And we certainly will have an opportunity to share our own war stories and experiences over the last 3 months. But before we do that, I wanted to remind all of us that you all come from pretty significant institutions, and that many of those schools of thought can be said to have formed an important historical role in the discourses that you yourselves have inherited. So before we look into the future, I'd ask you to speak to your respective institutions as canons, as platforms themselves. And what you find is the weight of what you've inherited, sometimes as a burden, sometimes as an opportunity. Maybe why did you select those schools to lead in the first place before the pandemic, and how that has formed your plight as you attempt to structure your own visions now within this extraordinary circumstance. So can you speak to history first before we look towards the future? And you know, I'm not going to call on people, but this is too easy not to. Ayla, maybe I can start with you. There's something about the presence of of UVA, its architecture, and its vision historically that deserves some recognition here?
Sure, happy to start, Nader. So I think it's interesting because we could say the University of Virginia that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, third president of the country and the author of the Declaration of Independence. He built the university as the first public academic institution that was supposed to embody in its physical manifestation an idea of democracy. And the academical village at UVA was an architectural invention that we could say equated a model of society and a model of education. And this notion that our current president always speaks about the great and the good, you know, the good being the idea of the public, and the great referring to the condition of excellence, let's say, or the aspiration to excellence of the university. And it's interesting to me, of course, that it's sort of classicism was imported from Europe to ennoble a parochial population, you know, historically, and to also instantiate a kind of democratic ideal in physical form or in built form. And this union of people, ideas, and architecture generated the human institution of the university. And the university was also a town. You know, the idea of the academical village brought together architecture, urbanism, and landscape into a kind of singular entity. But the key was the idea of building a democratic nation was dependent on an enlightened citizenry and the physical embodiment of its aspirational values in architecture, which I think is an interesting one. Now, of course, within our current climate, Jefferson's ideals, all men are created equal, is seemingly absurd within the context of his being a slave owner. And the fact that this public didn't include women, and UVA's historic role in relation to many of the issues that we're currently facing, racism, structural inequities, et cetera. I'm going to sort of put that aside for the moment, but also the fact that those that built the university and sustained it weren't considered to be part of this public. But I think one of the core pieces that still comes through is this idea of excellence and equity. And in spite founding principles, let's say, of the UVA School of Architecture, how one pursues design that matters or that makes a difference in the world, and its question for our discipline, or our disciplines, how do we ensure the integration of equity and excellence, or excellence and the democratization of education, which I think is interesting within the context of how we're operating currently, and conversely, equity within with excellence itself. I hope that at some point we can talk to the relationship of matter and technology, because I think, you know, part of the issues around this idea of equity is very much connected to the material world. And that becomes one of the key sort of pieces for me in also thinking about the future of the university.
Hashim, MIT places itself as one of the first, if not the first, programs of architecture to launch itself in the US. And I wonder, how is it, because I'm also considering, Ayla, you have the weight of history, but you also have the weight of recent history and the degree to which you're constrained by that. Hashim, might you outline some of the more immediate frictions that define how you're trying to formulate a vision for a very complex institution?
MIT indeed has a long history in terms of architecture education, being the first degree granting university in architecture in the United States. But I've noticed over my 5 years as dean at MIT how the place is very interested in its history, but not interested in tradition. And that distinction has formed the place's ethos for a long time. In many ways, MIT has thrived on being a bit outside of history, for the most part, wanting to be ahead of history. MIT defined itself as being first in Boston as a trade school, not a university, but then it moved to Cambridge so that it is on the other side, close to industry, not in Boston. Right. MIT clearly defined itself as not Harvard, and being not a liberal arts university, but a technology institute, right? So that distinction is very important historically and continues to define itself today that way. And then slowly taking on from being connected to industry, being connected to research. And the idea of a research university as distinct from a humanities-based teaching university still prevails at MIT. Not that teaching is external to our central mission, but it happens sometimes directly, but sometimes inadvertently through research. The radicalization of the mission of MIT towards the democracy has also grown out of a reaction to research and the sources of funding for research, particularly in the 60s, against defense, against government, and in that sense created a very strong awareness and a return to a tradition within MIT, I use the word tradition, sorry, that technology here is in the service of democracy. And I think since the 60s, every time you get admitted to MIT, you get a stamp on your forehead that says technology in the service of democracy. And it is etched in stone that technology is there to advance the arts in the dome of MIT. So the arts have been there from the inception. Architecture is course 4 of the 4 original degree granting departments. And in that sense, the role that technology plays in keeping MIT ahead of history and outside of tradition has been also a recurring, ethos, I don't want to call it ethos or theme, but a recurring practice. So we talked about the radicalization of the university in the 60s against the sources of funding for research and therefore imposing on the university or compelling the university to seek areas of research outside the defense, outside the conventional federally funded research. And then you were there, Nader, when this was happening, which is the open sourcing of all of the courses, the opening up of all of the syllabi to share with the world, that MIT is not about itself, it's about the world. Even its final fundraising campaign, the last one, was about the world. It's for a better world rather than for a better MIT. And in that sense, again, most recently, the use of edX, online education, and the advancement of possibility of creating courses for everybody in the world was central to became central to the mission. And in that sense, all we're doing right now in the online education, obviously, as Neil said, it is a kind of displacement. It is a shaking out of the physical space. But what we're doing is expanding on that dimension that has already started. And we can talk about the implications of that.
I know you're planning new physical spaces for the School of Architecture, and I have a question about that later. But as you think about that, I'm reminded of my years at the AA, Eva, and how radical a change or set of changes it has gone through over the decades. And it appears to be still ongoing with those kinds of changes. It has a deep history of its own, and yet it is more susceptible to reformulation and new visions. How do you place yourself and that school within the trajectory of this discussion?
Well, I mean, you know, the AA was founded by 2 students, 18-year-old and 23-year-old, that were trying to find space that would allow them to redefine what the education of an architect was, as a way to try to escape an idea that an architect was just a professional, that in fact an architect was just a builder. And I think that that spirit of trying to produce a space in which as architects or as citizens, we are not just there to build and to give form to the existing structures of power, but in fact, we are there to reformulate what are the questions that as architects, as builders of that society, we can pose to society and then also build them. I think it's probably, for me, one of the essential elements of the ethos of the AA. The AA is not a school that tries to train architects as a profession, but in fact tries to train architects as citizens. And I think that that is something that obviously has been changing throughout its 173 years of history. And it is part of the school's remit to try to question and redefine what is the figure of the architect in front of all the different changes and conditions and challenges. And probably, I think the fact that we are all here today, that we all different schools with very different remits and histories, we are all questioning where is the future of education going. I think what we need to somehow question first is what is that architecture contributes, and how does architecture contribute to address some of those issues, and how do we somehow extemporize the anxiety around some of the important questions around us, and really then put the question mark about architecture and what is that we mean when we try to define that term. If you want, my tenure within the AA has still just started in some ways. I've been here for 2 years, and I've been really trying to understand an institution that from the outside has a very cohesive identity, but in fact within the school is a universe with a multiplicity of agendas, voices, and ways of answering this question and redefining it. And that multiplicity probably is one that has an incredible tradition within the history of the school. And it is that wealth that for me, I think is very interesting, because ultimately as a school, we are not here to just deliver a body of knowledge, but in fact to constantly produce it and redefine it. And so when we talk about what is that we are trying to do in the school within these days is to really try to pause and to somehow try to ask again the very same questions that have over the millennia, if you want, define the idea of contributing to the built or design environment, and then say, okay, where do we bring our intelligence and expertise? And to obviously go back to some of those foundational questions about what are the shared forms of knowledge that we do have as architects, what is our disciplinary space of action, and try to identify what are the sources that we need to now define or redefine to keep on not only building sources for architectural form or source for architectural practice, but source for architectural action. And I think what we need to do is to really try to somehow regain a space of political and social and cultural relevance within the important decisions that are taking in the world that right now is more united than ever. And yet architecture has always felt that has always arrived late to those conversations that are ultimately shaping the world. So almost as a student, I always say any director that arrives to the AA arrives from the shoes of knowing that in fact the school has constantly tried to produce and disseminate ideas that challenge and advance the design of contemporary culture and cities and the environment, but we are constantly and fearlessly looking into the future in a way that we try to redefine that future in the ways in which we have inherited. And it is this kind of constant critique of the inherited values that we have received that I think the ethos of the school is built. And all of that is done within usually a series of physical spaces that, going back to Ila's founder, we shape architecture, therefore architecture shapes us, a series of buildings and spaces that have allowed for those conversations, for those units, from those domestic spaces to come together in a way in which you realize that knowledge is something that comes from the inside out. And myself also as a teacher, I've always operated as a midwife. And I think the AA as an institution wants to be a midwife for society and for the way in which architecture can contribute and should contribute to the way in which we intervene and we contribute ultimately to society in that larger scheme. But I think the idea that who has the power to set a vision and how do we all collectively now as head of different institutions come together to then identify not only what we do under our respective homes, but what is that we can all do together, for me, is probably one of the most powerful questions. It has to do with what Ila was saying about democratizing education, giving access. Who do we invite into the conversation? How do we change some of those sources of knowledge? And how do we start decolonizing a discipline that I think for many years has been maybe asking the wrong questions and also giving the wrong answers. And I think we do need an entire new set of priorities in order to maybe then keep on contributing to the world from an aesthetic, from if you want, poetic, but also from a political point of view.
Thanks for that. And I realize that I'm not completely immune from the very question that I posed to you. So maybe in response to your characterization, Eva, I'll simply place myself between two mythologies at Cooper Union. One is that of Peter Cooper, who founded the overall institution, and a reminder that, 150 plus years ago, New York City was an island of immigration. It took people in from all around the world. Many were educated, many were not. Those who were educated didn't necessarily speak English. Many had certain trades or crafts behind them. But the Cooper Union became an open institution, inviting anybody and everybody through its doors to begin to create a platform of equity and engagement with the world to show how industry, creativity, the arts and engineering come into conversation. That is a significant, there's a significant difference between that project and the project of John Haydock, which is effectively synonymous with the School of Architecture at Cooper Union. It is a myth you cannot escape, but if anything, we can historicize it now. But at the moment that he took over the reins of the School of Architecture, it was a moment when two things were happening. One, that the economy was very down and weak on the one hand, but architecture over the decades had become increasingly corporate and consolidated amongst a few corporate firms. And under those situations, the idea of assault through retreat in a monastic castle, whereby the explorations, experiments, and those things that belong strictly to the discipline, the formalisms, the spatialities, and the materialities became the basis of engaging the world. And I know that these two interpretations are vastly apart, and yet conceptually they were not meant to be, not even in Haydock's mind, and yet they mean very different things. And of course, we live in a very different world today. So it's strange that from a practical level, I do not need to respond to my direct predecessors or Haydock in such a concrete way. But we understand that to make a difference, we also have to figure out where our agency lies. Neil?
Thanks. Thank you, Nader. So I'm maybe different to the rest of you in the sense I'm not a head of a school, or I am, and also I have a number of different positions. I'm actually in Los Angeles now, in Venice Beach, not the same Venice as Hashim's Venice, but a different one. And much of the year I'm teaching at FIU in Miami. The summer, normally I am in Shanghai, Tongji University, Shanghai, where Philip Yuan and I set up the whole Digital Futures initiative. And occasionally, I haven't been there for many years, but occasionally, well, 4 years, occasionally I'm in Switzerland at the European Graduate School, which is a kind of a very interesting kind of nomadic institution in the sense it doesn't have a space. It just simply like a butterfly lands there in the summer for 3 weeks, and a PhD program takes place. So in some ways, I'm defined less by territorialization than deterritorialization. I operate a kind of in a rhizomatic way, a nomadic existence. And I guess what I think I want to throw in there is the idea. In fact, I've been doing this for a while. In the sense, when I was teaching at Columbia in '99 with Bernard, I was asking whether there was any openings coming up there, and he said, "Well, not now, but maybe you should do what Greg Lynn is doing and go become a visiting professor in many different places," which is actually what happened really much of the time. And it was interesting because I think what we had from that, and maybe Greg is not doing so much now, but people like Ben Bratton are teaching in Moscow, Shanghai, San Diego, Los Angeles, SciArc, and also in the European Graduate School. There is still that tradition, which I think has got actually produced the seeds of what potentially we have now, in the sense that in that space between 1999 and now, I think we've developed a kind of global classroom, in the sense that, you know, we get access to all the information through the digital. And I think what's also developed as a kind of industry has been a kind of educational tourism. And I think the AA and the BART have been good examples, especially with Chinese students, of people who are traveling around. And what's also happened, there are two other things. One is that the English has become the dominant world language, which for me, frankly, I'm very lucky. It's my language, but it has become the dominant language. So it means that not only can we travel around, we can even communicate without translation now. When I first went to Shanghai, everything had to be translated. Now we have lectures in English. And the other factor I'd say that's happened has been the kind of the development of an industry of cheap travel. EasyJet and so on. I used to fly to, when I was teaching in Dessa, I used to fly to Berlin with Ryanair, which was not a terribly, it was not the best airline, but nonetheless you could do this. And so we have a kind of global classroom that's evolved, and a kind of global form of operation which is displaced. And I think what I found interesting about the AA is not just simply that it was kind of, but at the time the MTech had just developed, and the AA-DRL was extremely strong. You had all these people coming from all over the world to the AA. And then in the paradox of the AA was that actually I had no British students. I didn't have a single British student in the 3 years that I was teaching there, which I thought was astonishing. So there was a kind of deterritorialized existence there. And the same went for the Zaha's office. I mean, that's where many of the students of DRL then used to go and shift. I think at the time there were 400 and only 6 with British passports there. And so I think what we have is a kind of, what's emerging is a kind of deterritorialized way of existence, and a nomadism, which I think importantly is not just a physical nomadism, but also an intellectual nomadism, which I think has sown the seeds for a potential rethinking of how we can operate today in a kind of deterritorialized space. So that's been my experience, and it's what forms me in many ways. And maybe I'll just say one more thing, and that is that one of the initiatives at the AA, which I thought was really beautiful, was, and it's no longer happening, but it was the London Consortium. The London Consortium was a collaboration between different institutions. The British Film Institution was part of it at one point, and Birkbeck College was validating the degrees, and there was a whole bunch of different institutions. Now, what was beautiful about this thing was it had no physical space. It literally had no physical space. And the lectures, they would rent a pub. And I remember giving a lecture in a pub in London. And, you know, that was already some kind of germ of a future way of thinking, which maybe, I mean, it's not so much confined by the architectural space, but more a kind of intellectual space. But anyway, I'll leave it there.
It's funny that your characterization also reminds me that while I was at MIT, as Hashim mentioned, there was committees on online learning and edX, and I was actually part of that. But the odd thing is that all of that had already started in some capacity anyway, but somehow the pandemic brought the rarefied nature of this discussion to all corners of the world, all schools, from elementary all the way to the PhD programs. And it makes me wonder that outside of the knee-jerk reaction that everybody had to, in a state of panic or urgency, make certain action items occur, as you look at the present from the perspective of the last 3 months plus, beyond the improvisations you've made, first, what are some of your initial takeaways? But moreover, with the idea that we may not want to or need to fight for the old normal, what aspects of this condition would you like to radicalize even further? And what aspects of on-campus learning do you think are irreducible that this allows to happen even more by virtue of taking certain things online? And so, given that everybody is still negotiating some form of hybrid semester next round, what, if we were to project forward 5 or 10 years, what could we dispense with altogether in order to imagine the instrumentality of this moment?
Maybe I'll throw a few things out there, Nader, and thank you, Neil. I love, you know, the idea of intellectual nomadism and the kind of deterritorialization of our institutions. And it's something, I mean, the global pandemic has been making us question the embodiment of the physical university, the physical social collective space, which of course is also the basis of our discipline. So I think for our architectural institutions, there's a whole other layer of this, right, within our unconscious. And when we are confined to private space, you know, our public space has become what Bill Mitchell called years ago this notion of the electronic agora, when, you know, referring to the beginnings of the World Wide Web. And the idea of the university gets dispersed into this kind of ether. And embracing the possibilities of this, of collective thought through dispersion in the absence of physical collective space, which has never been embraced so readily before, has raised a larger question to me about the relationship between digital technology and matter, or the matter of embodied experience, the matter of social experience, or the removal of material from the center of our practices. And also this idea of the reduction of space to an electronic picture plane, which is one that I don't think we've talked about enough, right? We're all sort of living in this two-dimensional world. The notion of talking heads has become real. And, you know, it's funny to me looking back into the not too distant past, that at the advent of the internet, there was this great belief that our ways of working would entirely change at that moment, right? And that working remotely would be the way of the future. But that didn't readily happen, except within certain industries, more because of our habits, the kind of reification of the real than anything else. And the pandemic or crisis, which I think is interesting because it's required us to open up new possibilities that are highly dependent on technologies to generate new experiences that are also not possible in physical space, and new kinds of connections that are not possible. You know, I had a conversation with our faculty in January about online education, and this was, you know, pre-COVID, and everybody just poo-pooed it and nothing kind of happened. And then a month and a half later, within 4 days, you know, we got an entire university online. And that was only because of the need and the fact that the crisis broke up, even if only momentarily, our idea of reality. You know, and reality based on, I often refer to reality as being the kind of dominant set of shared cultural myths of a particular moment in time. But we could also call it the reification of past forms of speculation or just habit, right? That reality in some ways become our habits. And so the issue always within architectural practice for me, because I believe that we are world makers, you know, so designing the new university within this context, I think, is the space for architecture. And that we create fictions that concretize our imaginations in this process, and we always contribute to the prototyping of the future. So, and the challenge for us is often the relationship between these forms of speculation and realism. Even if we, you know, if we understand reality, as I said, to be our habits, you know, the places that we're stuck, or the places of repetition. And so the challenge we have now is how that transformation occurs, because within our own institutions, there's still the habit of a mode of thinking that, you know, after this pandemic, we will return to a kind of normal practice. And yet we've discovered all kinds of new things that we would not have done otherwise, that I think is asking us to think about the framework of the university in general, the modes of education, not just as a hybrid, but the ideas of what are the things that need to happen in physical space and why, and what are the possibilities for all the things that can move far beyond that and that can create new models of education, entirely new models of education. And so I'm thinking it probably along a kind of spectrum from the most immaterial context, the context within which we share our ideas, to the most material, the spaces that we engage matter in the making of things, or you know, is this about just the way that we think about coursework, or is it about the way that we think about our social spaces? But I think there are an enormous amount of possibilities here, and the hope is that we don't just become reactive to it in a space of crisis, but that we actually see it as a space of potential design and transformation.
I mean, maybe not just to follow the usual order, but I mean, there is something very interesting, Ila, what you said now, but also connecting what Neil, you mentioned before in relationship to the AA and the London Consortium. And interestingly enough, I've been having so many conversations with institutions here in London, and this year we started talking with the ICA, that also was one of the members of the London Consortium. And I started to bring, so now when the crisis, if you want, hit all the institutions and all the institutions had to close down, we brought all the curators from the ICA to actually help us teach and also us help and support them. And so we started to see some of those new spaces of engagement with other institutions in the city. But that was part of an interesting new curriculum that I was already planning to create this academic year, that is called Speculative Studies, that is part of the new core studies within the AA. That because of the timing of having to launch Speculative Studies at the beginning of term 3, in the obviously already an entire new online provision, what we did was to somehow recast, recalibrate, and reconstitute this entire new curriculum with a series of characters and voices, from philosophers to anthropologists to artists to human rights lawyers, that were spread throughout the world, teaching classes from the Middle East to Chicago, and obviously being able to serve and to respond and to engage with the students that we have now distributed around 18 different time zones. And that in fact, as a school, we are now operating as a global digital school in which we have voices, not only students, but also teachers and collaborators literally spread within this global digital context. So Speculative Studies for me was a great laboratory to not only test the kind of teaching opportunities that now we have, because now we can engage with people that otherwise we would never be able to bring. And at the same time to be able to allow a space of reflection and discussion on something as urgent, obviously, as it is this global crisis, from obviously issues of health, but also issues, fundamental aspects of society, and how do we come together? That has been the question that Hashim has been asking us now for the last 2 years. And for me, what was very interesting about that experiment is that it somehow allowed me to think and respond to one of the things that we all have had to answer, that is, how do we do something as traditional as the project's review, no, or the end of the year show? How do we celebrate, look, and put all the work that our students and academic staff have produced throughout the year in a way that we are able to access it and to share it, and to start those conversations that are going to feed, no, the next academic year? And so what we did this year, and responding, Nader, to your question about things that we have done differently in response to this current situation. So what we did was to do a projects review in which we all have been engaging with the domestic spaces of everyone, no, with their bedroom backgrounds and kitchen backgrounds, and the students have been producing work in very different conditions, but we did a projects review that started from Sydney, no, and ended up in Los Angeles, going like through the planet, passing the baton almost as the New Year's Eve, celebrations as an opening ceremony for an end of the year show that was purely a response to the current situation, but also gave us the opportunity to think about the great power of people coming together in ways that we would have never imagined. And so the idea that then each student had the responsibility to curate and to present their work to a global audience, but also to our internal audience, that ultimately Projects Review is a celebration that the school does for itself, for me was a fascinating and beautiful moment. But of course, all this has put in question many of the ideas that we all had about education and this nomadism, Neil, and this kind of cheap airfare passport that we all were using and abusing over the last few years, polluting the planet in ways that we were trying to excuse, if you want, in the name of knowledge transfer and exchange. And that I think now we are all becoming more conscious and aware about what is that we do need to do in order to communicate, and when do we have to travel. And the idea of traveling, I think, is going to radically go into an entire new dimension, in the sense that we know we only communicate almost like 20% of what we actually are saying when we are in this flat screen, this flattening surface. And there are more things that we transmit sometimes by our bodies, by our presence, by things that we cannot even measure or in a technological way abstract and retransmit, that we are able to accept. So of course we are losing a lot, because we are individuals who actually are physical, and that technology is constantly an exercise of trying to abstract that reality and present it and represent it. And it is a problem of representation. But one of the projects that, since I arrived at the AA, I was extremely eager to launch was learning from something that the AA also did 10 years ago, was to launch this visiting school, with trying to engage with local cultures, with a specific context, and trying to bridge, the kind of incredible and advanced research in relationship to technology and digital practices, but also in many different areas that the academic staff and students develop within the school, and then be able to engage with those questions within a global understanding, but with a local desire. And so for me, what was interesting, I was attempting, to then thread each one of all those different experiments globally to try to then understand two things. What is the global context, but what is the local knowledge and understanding that each one of us can generate and contribute from each one of our spaces and locations, so that we can reinforce both, that kind of newfound space of globalization that we have been accepting and has been building, and that now we have fully accepted. But at the same time, I'm very eager, and I think it's very important to reinforce the local and the knowledge that is produced and that has been produced through millennia, through issues of language, through issues of material, through issues of botany, through issues of culinary expertise, and how each one of those things comes together to constitute a community, that it comes to constitute a space of understanding, of communication, and ultimately of care, And I think this, the fact that right now we have seen countries, cities, regions be redrawn, not in a kind of political fictional boundary, but in areas of care, Who can take care of each other, and how do we reconstitute the world around those ideas of care, not only in a medical sense, but also in a cultural sense, but also in many other ways in which we need to actually start redrawing the world and representing it, and by representing it, reconstituting it. And so I think these are some of the things, from speculative studies to really trying to produce cultural events that allow us to really think and come together. 2 weeks ago, we launched an open call to our alumni and members. We have more than the AA is a school, but it's also an association in which we have more than 7,000 members around the world. And we are trying to actually use this moment in which we are all in our homes, trying to see how we contribute, how we participate in these conversations and in these questions. And so we ask, what are the spaces that we believe we need to design or we need to build as we are trying to teach, And so the open call was the spaces that teach. And those spaces can be digital, can be virtual, can be physical, but we need to understand what is that we are able to transmit in each one of them, and what are those things that for us are essential that cannot actually be transmitted in others, and that we actually may have to produce new technologies and new forms of abstraction, representation, and dissemination to be able to transmit them back. And I think MIT, for instance, has been really good in identifying technologies that have been able to abstract the world, to represent it, and to present it anew. But the open call is still open until the 3rd. So if anyone has, and then of course this is, today is the 3rd, even if it is not, I invite everyone who wants to contribute some ideas about what are those spaces of pedagogical engagement that the future needs to see produce and build, so that we can keep on learning and learning also differently.
On the topic of the local and the global, I know that we've all been impacted by recent events that were very local in the United States, but have actually reverberated not throughout the United States, but around the globe itself. So besides the online experience, I know that our own student community at Cooper Union has been incredibly active in forming a new set of questions, challenges, and prompts to the administration after the demonstrations launched by the death of George Floyd, and many others, of course. Beyond social injustice and racial inequities, I was also pleasantly surprised at the nimble way in which their statements have drawn in other themes into the same discussion. The LGBTQ movement, access to health and education, global warming and its connection to climate inequity, among a range of other themes. So they've brought a multi-dimensionality to our current predicament facing education, and with a certain sense of resolve. So as you look beyond online learning, how are you looking at the current moment to reshape discourse in your schools? And I ask this with a balanced respect for the questions being posed at my school. Beyond hiring policies, mental health, and personal accountabilities, there's a deep yearning for the decolonization of our curriculum entirely. And I suspect by your generations, all of us have a pretty firm understanding of what constitutes our epistemological base. But how would you bring a more expansive definition to this question? And how are you thinking about the intellectual, curricular, and epistemological opportunities that these set of questions are bringing to us as academies, and in turn, translating those online?
How much time do we have left, by the way? Half an hour? Is it till 1:30?
We have a whole hour if we want. A whole hour.
Fantastic. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, because Nader, I was preparing to answer some of the vignettes that came out of very rich interactions earlier, and then you asked us this other important question, which is going to open up hugely important questions in itself.
I invite the trajectory, so please take it in any direction you want.
Okay. I feel like the wealth of the discussion earlier has led us in different places, and I can't pretend to synthesize. Maybe I can make a series of small observations that relate to them. On how Corona and the COVID-19 pandemic will affect space, and maybe the space of teaching, meaning the School of Architecture. I'm not running away from the question by saying it's too soon. It's too soon to say that. But at the same time, we can benefit from what we're seeing in front of us and what happened in the past in situations like this, to say that sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes the different possibilities that we're polemicizing today will happen at the same time. During the Second World War, people were saying it will be the end of cities and the birth of suburbia, and others saying it will be the revitalization of the inner city. Both happened, but happened at different paces and different places with different degrees of success and failure. In Lebanon after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, we were reimagining completely the possibility that we will be able to live on the higher floors with big glass windows Instead, we wanted to reimagine the basement as being the place of cohabitation the way it was during the war. The collective amnesia that happened after the war deleted all of that, and the facades even became more glossy, and the basements even more abandoned, and the public spaces even more public. There was a kind of reaction to that. And I think, Nader, you and I noticed that when we had dinner the other day on a cafe, which was on a cafe trottoir, which was actually built over the service spots that that restaurant had. So instead of having a valet area, they put a boardwalk, and we actually had dinner there. Taking over the public space instead of retracting from it is one of the side effects of the pandemic, which one would have expected to be temporary, but it seems like it's going to stay. It's an interesting, unusual reversal. But I also feel that the most important changes that happen as a result of changes of perception. And these will take time for us to be able to register, meaning the perception of the other, the distances that we have in relationship to other people that make us comfortable. Those will probably take time to settle, whether into code, into norms, into behavioral decorums, and then they will affect space. So I feel like this is something to wait. But if anything, on the architectural school dimension, this is a tough question, especially when you're, as you said, in the process as MIT to build a new building for the School of Architecture and Planning. Liz Diller, by the way, is the architect, and she's doing an amazing job there. But if I can hear something out of the students, it is precisely the necessity of what I think Eva was talking about, and Ayla as well, the material presence becomes even more heightened because you're able to replace it in most circumstances with the virtual presence. But when you decide to go out, becomes extremely important. And when you come out is to create those unexpected, unmapped, ungridded possibilities of interaction is extremely important. That's why I feel coming out to the street is part of the way we're rethinking the building, meaning engaging the public realm much more forcefully, having programs on the street that bring in Cambridge, bring in the world, provide spaces after hours for the neighborhoods, for the underrepresented groups in the neighborhoods to be able to have a space, having a cafe that is run by underrepresented minority groups. These are right now front and center. And how to magnify the public realm of the building, because that is what is needed, has become also very important. Are they foretelling a future in the way we're going to think about space or not? I'm not sure, but this is the reality we're facing right now. And it's very, very interesting, very interesting.
Maybe I can just add to that. This is a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much. I will just mention just briefly how this whole event happened, which is kind of weird. Philip Yuan and I had a discussion back in February, because normally we have an event in Shanghai every year and we try and make it completely global, bringing people there. And it's worked quite well, but obviously this year it was going to be impossible. So in February we said, okay, let's not do anything. And then in April, I was holding my review, not in Miami because I was in LA, but my students were in Miami. And we invited some jurors from Philip Yuan from China, Wang Yu He from Shenzhen in China, and then Gilles Retzin from London. And all of a sudden you realize actually, rather than being this kind of constraint, in many ways there were these possibilities afforded by the digital that could be taken further. The following week, Matthias Del Campo had his review at the University of Michigan, and he live streamed it, and he got over 1,000 people following his review. Now, that's astonishing in itself, in a way. It opens up all these kind of possibilities. And at the same time, there are certain constraints that come out of this kind of this new operation. The logo that you can probably see on the screen, it was devised. That was how we tried to calculate how we could make an international event happen. That's a study of the different time zones around the world. And one is kind of Europe, Africa, and West Asia, Middle East, and the other one's kind of Americas, and then there's one about Asia Pacific. And they don't necessarily overlap, but there is one particular time zone when we can get a moment when things happen together. So at the moment, this session is being broadcasted 8 p.m. Eastern EST, that's 8 a.m. in the morning in China. So all these things kind of, what's interesting is you kind of, the same time you become aware, things get connected, but you become aware of the differences. I mean, I think one of there are also these kind of questions of translation, whether even the ideas are, whether we can understand the other. Someone mentioned the question of the other. I mean, I'm interested in the notion of translation, having been a translator myself, and Walter Benjamin has a notion about, has an understanding of translation, saying translation is impossible. You can translate words, but you can't really translate the concept. So he says, he used the example of bread, and he says, you know, you can take the word bread, and in German it's Brot, and in French it's pan, and so on and so on. But what the Germans mean by bread is this kind of thick, solid black thing you can build houses with, very different to the baguette, you know. So what's happened in some ways is actually, it's both revealed, it's connected us, but also revealed the differences that have been going on between us. But what I will say though, this is maybe a point to Eva. Actually, strangely, you know, we in this disembodied world, of course, we lose out on a lot of things. We lose out on that physical communication. But one thing that's become apparent to me in our conversations is actually there's something that's been gained that is quite surprising, and that is that. I mean, I was brought up. I'm not religious, right? But I was taught by monks in a Benedictine monastery, and I was brought up a Catholic. We had this thing where we would go to confession. It was kind of a weird thing. There was a kind of priest behind a screen, and you would kind of confess your sins, and then you get told to say 5 Hail Marys or something like that. And it was very weird because you couldn't really see the priest. And you somehow felt enabled to kind of confess because you couldn't see that person. And there's something interesting, confessional, actually, in a strange way, about working online, where I'm talking to my laptop in some ways. And they're discovering now, in the case of kind of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, people find it much easier to talk to robots, to AI bots, than to talk to people. And it opens them up in a kind of new way. So I think what's happening now is we're discovering all sorts of kind of opportunities, affordances that we didn't have before, and at the same time difficulties. And in many ways, this whole project is an experiment. What could we learn by operating in this kind of way? I think what's important is to think that tradition is not set in stone. Tradition is alive, and one can reinvent tradition. I love the thinking of Judith Butler, who always talks about this thing, how you can reinvent how the world is by simply instantiating a different kind of form of practice that eventually becomes hegemonic. And I think now's a chance for us to rethink a lot of things that we've taken for granted, that we thought were enshrined literally in stone, that need to be shaken up. And maybe one example of what I would say is that, you know, when I was a student at the University of Cambridge, we'd go to the library, and I remember spending many hours sort of browsing through the bookshelves and sniffing the books, right? You know, literally, you know, and that's how I kind of like it was wonderful in a way. But now we don't need libraries. In fact, actually, most universities, the libraries are places where you go for a quiet place to work. The access to knowledge comes through the computer. So that whole physical space of the library becomes called into question. Do we need libraries in that way? So I think now is really a wonderful opportunity to rethink what we've taken for granted, and to explore the possibilities afforded by this different domain that has both advantages and disadvantages. You know, and so I think as architects, you know, we should be we're planners, we're designers, and I think we really should take charge of this and try and imagine a better future world. And I think, just to say one final thing, is that, of course, architecture is physical. Of course, buildings are physical. But much of what we do is not physical. I mean, Alberti defines the architect as somebody who conceives in the mind and realizes through construction. So much of what we do is not really physical. It's a conception in the mind. And I think that we have to really, you know, use that opportunity, that imaginative space of the architect, to rethink what it might be, the intellectual space of a university, which may not be so constrained by the physical space of architecture anymore.
You know, you remind me that in principle, architects don't build, they draw. And that I do love your metaphor of the confessional, because there's a social dimension to that. But there's also an instrumental dimension to that, as if the picture plane of that confessional, the screen, is somehow in some way respondent to the screen through which you and I are speaking right now. Over the past 3 months, I realized, we realized this before, but it became more evident now, that there are 2 modalities of teaching. And one, of course, is discursive, and it centers on words and concepts and ideas, and that it can be done with one arm's length. But the other one is very much an engagement, where you reach through the picture plane and engage the other person on the same picture plane by drawing on their drawing and their drawing on your drawing. And it reminds you of that the space of discussion has nothing to do with me looking at your face or you recognizing my voice even. It has to do with understanding the medium through which we operate as architects. And there are still architects whose inventive ability to project onto a 2-dimensional space does certain things that cannot be done by the lawyer, the sociologist, or the politician. So I bring you back to Eva's earlier question about what is it that we bring to that table. It is not that we take away words, it's that we bring certain new dimensions of projection, and somewhere, somehow, this projection plane on which we're operating now allows us to do that together in a way we may have been too inhibited to do before. We actually draw together.
Go ahead, Hashim.
No, all I want to do is to push this discussion a little bit further to a space that I think has become a bit too sacred over the past 100 years in architecture, which is the studio. I think in the past semester of trying to do everything online, we are still adhering to the studio as a sacred space which we're trying to simulate online. Repeating its exercises, repeating the mode of critique, repeating the idea of self-realization through a project by a student, repeating many things which I find to require questioning, deeper questioning on the part of architecture educators, but have for some reason remained above suspicion. I do hope that the online experience that we have, or the way that we have thrown the studio into the online, will help shake that up, but it hasn't yet. So I'm hoping that we can have that discussion, if not today, sometime soon.
We talk about structural inequities and structural racism, and there's a dimension to the way in which we conceptualize architectural education around the core of studio, with other courses being saddlebagged external to the space of the studio. And that's more or less a structural scenario, to the degree that certain people are not allowed to talk about design while others are. To the extent that I found certain discussions productive, it has been to allow people to speak in arenas in which they're either not experts or alleged experts, or to be able to challenge the premises of certain experts within the closure of their own autonomous spaces. And I don't know if all of your curricula embody the same bias as mine, but I suspect they do.
I wanted to maybe tie some of these threads together. The question of the studio on the one hand, to this notion of decolonizing our curriculum. Because on the one hand, it's been interesting to me that at the very moment that other disciplines were trying to integrate our models of experiential learning into other discursive spaces, is the moment that we've had to abandon, that experiential model. At the same time, I'm also interested in going back to this relationship between the digital world that we are now operating in, or the virtual world, and the issue around how we decolonize our curriculum. Because the decolonization of the curriculum questions the ideological underpinnings of our discipline. And part of this decolonization is the way in which the ideas and the values of a few, we could say historically, the few white heterosexual Christian men, have instrumentalized the matter of all, right? And we can extend that matter to populations, other species, etc. You know, Hashim, your reference to the taking to the streets, you know, the idea of protest, for me is a kind of protest of the material world in a way, because it's also about taking back the street and with it the reconstruction of the idea of the public, you know, as a part of that, you know, the definition.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, but one of the things that has been clear to me is that disembodiment has been a strategy of colonization, right? You know, the disembodiment, it's our sky cult, or the world of ideas that overlays the kind of material world, going back to Plato. And so the question of vulnerability, our most vulnerable populations during this whole pandemic have been those whose work and lives are tied to the material world. Service industries that feed us, care for us, transport us, those things that require human contact, and those things that haven't integrated technology or can't be displaced by technology or don't have access to technology. So that while there's a collapsing of the globe on the one hand, there's also been a widening of the gap between those most connected to the material world and therefore often the most vulnerable, and those who could most easily shift their practices, right? And that divide was opened up over the last few months. But the other thing that's sort of interesting to me, and this is goes outside, let's say, of the human world and the pandemic, it's one of the unintentional consequences of our self-quarantine and reliance on the digital world, has been that we've been forced to leave the world, the physical material world, alone more than usual. And in a very short period of time, you know, we watched the skies clear over cities. We watched the rewilding of environments, you know, from which so many species had retreated. And witnessing this event, we've also become aware of how our anthropocentric crisis has not been shared by the natural ecologies that we have so readily instrumentalized for our own use. Right, so that the slowing of human production meant a reprieve, right, for the rest of the year. So there's a whole other, the colonization of our planet that I think is part of this. And I think these things are intertwined, and to me, offer interesting potential alternatives, but also there are conflicts that exist within them. Because we could say that the moving to a more virtual platform helps us achieve other environmental conditions that we couldn't figure out a way out of within our existing structures. But at the same time, it also is a problem for us in another way, because of the relationship. It comes back to the relationship between these technologies, who has access to them, and the kind of material or bodily world. And those are the questions I'm asking myself that might move outside of the real specifics of what does it mean for our studio culture and what does it mean for education. But I think they are intimately tied, you know, to the conversation.
Neil, I just realized that I do have an appointment. It just popped up at 1:30. So for some reason, they told me till 1:30. And I do not want to leave the space without responding to what Ayla took on and to what Nader asked us as a very important question regarding racial justice. But I would like Eva to speak first.
No, please, Hashim, go ahead.
Nader, what you asked is extremely important, and I cannot be more excited about the way that this movement is forcing us, compelling us to change things fast. Obviously, the question that you raised about decolonization and uprooting of the base biases, whether implicit or explicit, in our curriculum is happening. And I am supporting it fully. And the discussions are very, very rich. The challenging things that are emerging right now, I want to share them with you to see if people are experiencing them. And I'm really interested in seeing them unfold. One is who speaks on behalf of whom. For the longest time, we have been dealing with the question of diversity as being women diversity, racial diversity, different kinds of underrepresented minorities. It's no longer seen as an adequate approach. There's a strong desire on the part of everybody that people speak for themselves, that every group, every form of representation is direct. It cannot be mediated because the mediation is taking away from the intensity and the veracity of the problems. There's also, I don't know if you're seeing that, but there is a deep impatience with process. We're not going to lay out processes that will not get us anywhere. Affirmative action, this or that, they haven't worked. We need solutions faster. We need accountability faster. And I welcome that quite a bit. I also feel that there is a demand on the part of the Black students, the underrepresented minorities, that we create a space within the institution for them not just to be students or faculty, but to be citizens. And I think both Eva and Ayla referred to that, and Neil in a way with the kind of different global citizen, and Nader too. What kind of citizen we are shaping is going to become increasingly more important. And lastly, I feel like there is a question that has become very central, which is in a way related to the idea of admissions, is the question of meritocracy. The very basis on which we decide who comes in and who gets promoted, etc., has been meritocracy. But we are now going deep into questioning that very construct and what it entails. What kind of biases and exclusions does it contain? So I think it's a kind of shake-up that is welcome. We want to make sure that, like many revolutions, it doesn't leave things exactly where they are, but that it does move things. So I'm working with the faculty and with the students to address many of these questions. Again, here they're unfolding, but unfolding in very interesting ways. I don't know how it is in your environments, Eva, Ayla, Neil, Nader.
The question of meritocracy is a very central one at Cooper Union, if only because over time and history, the idea of access to free education became equated with meritocracy. But people have argued that in the moment of Peter Cooper, it had nothing to do with meritocracy. It had to do with who signed up first, because the diversity of people that got in was on a completely level playing field. Currently, precisely by introducing the notion of meritocracy, you are looking at an admissions process which is in some way the same as everywhere else, if not a little bit different because of our home test. But the question of your first 12 years of education, your formulation as an individual, as a subject, in summer schools, in extracurricular programs, in everything that shapes your mind, your body, your muscles, produces a field that is anything but level. And so there is no such thing as comparing two candidates like that. So it has discredited the notion of meritocracy altogether.
Yeah, I mean, starting from the idea of meritocracy, and we have been having a lot of conversations at the AA about admissions and how do we recognize those students that come to the school, not necessarily because of its history and legacy, but in fact because they have that kind of idiosyncrasy within themselves in which they know that the journey that they are going to take is one of self-discovery, but also of the redefining what is that actually we would expect a student to come out with. And the idea of the generation of new knowledge and the decolonization of the curriculum, it starts by accepting people that actually are different, that come from different forms of knowing. And I think that that is something that process is power. And we do need to change the processes by which we are allowing people to move, to engage with each other, and the positions and the relationships of power that are produced among them. And I think the idea of like fairness and equality is the one that we do need to make sure that we are constantly looking and making sure that it does take place. Because while we sometimes rely that the process is fair, I think that the problem here is that the process is what lacks its ability to be fair. But I'm going to try to stitch three different elements. We were talking about what are the things that we have not been able to do because of this digital context. And one of the things that I wanted to launch this term was a series of lectures that were called Off the Record. People would come to the AA lecture hall. There would be no cameras. Phone would be left by the entrance. And people would be able to actually explain, architects, artists, builders, developers, whoever it was, and to explain the difficult histories that we refuse to talk about. Because they are difficult, because they are complex, because they don't make the space in the monographs, because they don't make the articles in the newspapers, except when they are dramatic in terms of a spectacularization of it. And I think that what we do need to produce as institutions of higher education, or however we want to produce a label for us, is safe spaces in which people can start disentangling the way in which we exist and actually make things happen. So this off the record disappeared, and now we are constantly in this space that, despite that it looks like a confessionary, it is constantly on the record. Everything we say, we know is going to be played and replayed back to us. We might have the illusion that this is being broadcasted, but this is being recorded in eternity and perpetuum. And still we keep on working on this idea of linear time, when in fact, probably what we would want to do at some moment in time is to start thinking in this space in which things are recorded and can be rearticulated and resampled anew every single time. But so what we did, we started 2 years ago an entire new series, a lecture series that was called New Canonical Histories, right? As a way to really try to question that idea that I received many times through my education, that they were like, Eva, but you need to learn the canon, right? And at that point already, I was questioning that idea of the canon and how does one actually understand what is that we mean by discipline and disciplinary expertise, and who do we allow to actually feel that they own what disciplinary issues are and how we redefine those. And I think that to me, like the series of lectures and debates that we started with that series was just a soft way to really start thinking about, obviously, how do we go into then the core curriculum, the way in which history and theory, the way in which technology, and absolutely every single space within our practice and discipline, it has been built with issues of race oppression, questions of gender oppression, and architecture is complicit in many of the big problems that we do need to face. And so I do think that we do need to pause in a big time, I think, as Hashim was saying, and to really start thinking where and how we intervene in ways that are truly meaningful and that can really maybe not necessarily just fill a gap, but open a gap. And to open that gap and to sometimes not necessarily have the answer, I think is as important as that. And I will connect to something that Neil was saying. We did start another project that is called Architecture in Translation, right? That in which we were trying to make sure at the AA we have 81 nationalities. We speak more than 40 languages. And what obviously I find myself constantly is unable to find the right term. And usually I build 10 words that I think are more precise than any other word in any other language. But architecturally, especially, there are terms, there are words that actually do not translate culturally. And what we have done within the space of globalization and the kind of hegemonic space of English is to reduce that wealth that culturally we have been building for, again, and I use this word many times today, millennia of years. And so for me, the project of Architecture in Translation, while it is a cultural one, it is a disciplinary one, and it is one of resistance, and it is one of trying to decolonize that curriculum and to try to translate into jargon, forms of being, and forms of understanding, from music to everything else. But the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, we had an event at the AA, the AA Visions, that allows us to set the course about how we are going to move the next academic year. And we brought the academic staff, the students, and the administrative staff in a set of conversations about diversity, a term that we need to take, and I think we do need to reconstitute, and we need to open bare, and to actually ask everyone to make a list of demands and issues that each one of us individually have experienced, and things that we actually can share, and things that we believe we need to change. And I mean, the incredible movement that is happening right now around the world, I think is essential for us to really change ourselves as institutions and to change as a discipline, and to really obviously look into systemic problems, but also to think about this idea of equality from a very, very sincere point of view, and to realize how unequal our discipline has been, and how unequal education is, and the digital gap, and all the different gaps that we have produced. And so, I mean, Nader, you have opened an entire question for entire 3 more hours of discussion, but I do think that the way in which architecture education has operated until now is under threat in so many ways. The libraries that we have do not necessarily even hold the books. As Nader, as you know, I'm interested in those books yet to be written, on those histories, and in the ways in which we actually need to still rewrite those histories, reconstitute them anew, so that we can actually have a space of understanding about what are the values and the aspirations for the generations to come. We do have a responsibility that somehow we have taken our privilege of looking to this future for granted. And I think we do need to actually pause to really think and to share. Meaning, I do think that the moment in which we are able to find curriculums that are able to question some of those inherited histories, we should produce a kind of a pan-school, pan-university histories of architecture that are about that, about opening up those histories. And I think what I would love out of this, Neil and everyone, is what is that we as institutions can share to help and to support us in this exercise of opening up the gaps and starting to bring different voices.
I'm going to try to, I know, Hashim, you need to leave. So if you want to close up what you were thinking about, and then I'll try to start the beginning of the wrap-up.
This is very enriching. I don't want to go. I'd like all of you, find myself in the moment where I have to do the things I have to do instead of the things I want to do. I want to stay here. But hey, I just want to share with you an observation. I think it was Deleuze who said it about Foucault, that an age does not precede the technologies, the visibilities that shape it. And in that sense, what we're experiencing today is a radicalization of things that exist, or a re-instrumentalization of things that already exist, and we're trying to give them the symbolism of the moment, which is the COVID crisis. And I do strongly believe that what the digital was promising us earlier is being realized more and more today, particularly at the level of questioning the architectural education. And if I can share with you from what I'm hearing and what I have been experiencing, that these are promises that have yet to be fulfilled, but I feel that the digital has given us the possibility of a scalar blur between different scales of production and different scales of problems that we're taking on. But we haven't yet gotten out of our understanding of design as being from the teapot to the city. I think we need to enlarge the table, and we need to bring in other experts. This diversification and expansion of the scope of the architect, this kind of overture, has yet to happen to respond to that instrumental scalar blur. The other thing I think has a lot to do with the values that the digital has brought in. The designer in the studio still is the holder of the value system, projecting them onto the product goes into the world, gets experience, and then brought back, and the designer may adjust, but the values are still in the head of the designer. But that's not how production works anymore. Open sourcing of production is open sourcing of the values as well. We need to bring that open sourcing into the studio. It has not happened yet, including the points of view of the end users, but also the very different voices that might contest the canons, might contest the very underlying biases that are contained in what we deal with. That, I think, has to be radicalized even further. I think the other one, which Nader and I have talked about before, has to do with the notion of contingency. the studio format allows certain questions to be posited in the studio as essential to what makes architecture and leaves others out. Revit, all forms of digital representation have allowed us to bring in budget, bring in technology, bring in construction, bring in process, which we have seen to be external to the essence of design. I think we need to do more of that. And I feel that the online dimension is going to allow us to do more of that as well. And then finally, if I can say something about the material dimension, I completely agree that this moment has made us realize that there's the virtual and the conceptual in design and in architecture that we need to think about. But it has introduced the material at different levels. Before, the allographic nature of architecture was such that you would draw, represent, and then produce the model, and then the model is a simulation of the build. Now the material and the representation are interspersed. And I find that to be an extremely radical way of thinking about design, which will force us to think about what point do we make a model, what point do we make a prototype? Is the prototype necessary to be produced after or before? I think all of these questions are unfolding, but I urge you, I beg you, Neil, maybe to bring us together again so that we can talk about that sacred space, which is the studio. I believe the studio is dead, but that the studio will come back in a very different format, but we're just not declaring it yet. And we're not discussing it openly yet.
Thank you, Hashim. I'm sorry we won't have you here to close it out, but I'll pose maybe my last prompt to everybody else. And
Thank you.
Is it possible, Nader, just to go and add something to what Hashim has said, just briefly? I think the idea of open source is actually really kind of interesting, because what we've seen in terms of software is people making their code open source, they're providing free plugins, and there's been a different sort of operation happening where the corporate world has given way to a different kind of logic. And I think what you get with these kind of, I see today's moment within a kind of history of kind of moments of disruption in the sense that have been going on. For example, you could go back to May 68 and say maybe June 2020 is the kind of May 68, or indeed the collapse of the Iron Curtain in November 89, or the end of the Second World War. So a series of these things. And what's happened at these kind of watershed moments, it's kind of shaken things up. We got out of May 68 a kind of a re-injection or an injection of new ideas from people like Michel Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and so on. But what we got out of the Second World War was actually, certainly my country, in the UK, was a huge social change. You know, the introduction of the welfare state, of free healthcare. I mean, the National Health Service, I didn't realize how good it was until I got outside of the UK and realized, you know, in some ways, the tragedy in America right now is the fact that there are millions, and going up as they lose their jobs, who are uninsured. And we're in a situation, I think, that's not just simply the Black Lives Matter, there's also inequality in terms of other kind of issues which run deep in society. And one of the things that I kind of believe in is trying to make education free and healthcare free. And of course, it's not so easy at all. But this is one of the projects behind what we were trying to do today. And I'm with this project, and I'm really grateful that people kind of responded to the call, the manifesto, and kind of freely gave their time for others. And then that's a wonderful response, because we've had both the best and the worst of humanity coming out in this crisis. And this has been one of the best things. Also, I would put it alongside the kind of production of PPE by certain people in schools of architecture, 3D printing things, and so on. And I think there's something really very gratifying that comes out of being able to share knowledge in this kind of way for free. And it's something that I'm really keen on. We always has been the case in DigitalFUTURES, everything's been free, and I'm really keen on that. And I remember the first, we have a theory workshop with Antoine Picon and Sanford Quinto and Marika Trotter, and we started up, and these faces appear on the screen, and there's some guy saying, "Hi, Professor, I'm in Lima, Peru." And you just thought, wow, that's incredible. You know, it's really incredible. Someone in Lima, Peru is following this, and not just Lima, Peru, and we have a lot of people in Brazil following our workshop, and Iran, and so on. It's really quite extensive. And that goes back to something that I really feel that we need to address also, is that how do we open up education in a way? When I taught at the AA, it was wonderful. You know, I really loved being there. What I like about the AA is that it remains an open space. So lectures, I remember when Mark Cousins was giving his lectures on a Friday evening, it doesn't happen anymore, but people will come in from across London. It became a kind of agora, a kind of space of debate, and everyone could get in for free. Now, of course, it was expensive. It is still expensive to study at the AA. After the AA, I moved to Dessau, and what was kind of really very special about that is it really was almost free. It was like €200 a semester. And what happened there, what I discovered is we got people from all the poor countries in the world. Bangladesh being one example. I had 4 amazing students from Bangladesh who had got offered a place at AADRL, they just couldn't afford to go there. So what we kind of set up was this kind of project, we called it the Poor Man's AA or Poor Person's AA, whereby we try and produce some of the ideas or disseminate some of the ideas that they would get elsewhere, but at a kind of minimal cost. And what I came across from that, what I did was that the conclusion I came to from that, an amazing experience, it was really a very special experience, is the top 2%, well, it could be 3% or something, but the top 2% of every country in the world is talented. And the problem really is there is a kind of an architecture of exclusion in some sense that some really can't afford to go and study in this way. And so what I'm hoping in some way, and it's a very difficult question because we can't avoid the economic kind of question, how do you pay for people and so on. What I'm hoping is that somehow we can democratize architectural education and reach out so that people from Lima, Peru, or from Dhaka, Bangladesh, and so on can be part of that community. Because I think that's I don't know, I feel that very from my heart. And that's one of the gratifying things that right now is that people are enjoying this in some way, but also the fact that we're stepping outside of the kind of financial world and everyone's generously giving their time for free. So I'm not sure how this will go forward, but I just hope that somehow we can democratize things also in terms of kind of financial issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I can just add to this, because I think you just obviously mentioned our house. One of the things that I did since I arrived at the AA is to actually open and to offer full scholarships. So for the first time in decades, we actually are now fully advertising that. And of course, it's a matter of outreach and it's a matter of people applying. But and still there are barriers of entry in terms of like the application. And now we also have managed, obviously, because of this move, to have interviews online. But it is something that for me, it is essential. I became an architect because I constantly was supported by fellowships and scholarships. And I want to make sure that the AA is that the space for those incredible students that they want to reinvent the world of education and architecture for themselves and for everyone else. And that is ultimately what the school offers. But it's, I think what we are actually seeing here is that that democratization can take into an entire new form and actually outside of that institutionalize the space into something that is much larger. But I still would like to maybe respond to what Hashim was talking about, the studio and the size and the space and the medium, no? And the power of that space that teaches us. And what are the new formats that we can configure? We all know that each one of these platforms has its limits, 200, 4, you can see 5 people at once, you can see 25 people at once, how much? And so the truth is that these spaces have their own constraints and constituencies. And so the question here is, how do we make sure that also this ocular-centric and acoustic-centric space of teaching and learning that now we have to engage with is not only accepted as a kind of adaptation, but we are also to develop technology. I think as architects, we also have the responsibility to produce new spaces that allow us to engage with that space. But I think it is very important that we, as all of us, as institutions that offer very different ways of teaching architecture, allow for people who otherwise would not be able to access it to be part of us. And that has been one of my main priorities and part of my mandate. So, but Nader, I know we have to wrap up and here you go.
The reality is that all of you are touching up on a kind of political dimension of leadership that we've all been experiencing. Zooming out of the question of architecture, as you look at leaderships around the world, from the US to Russia to China, among other places, the pandemic has been an opportunity with two facets. On the one hand, they've taken this as an opportunity to suspend normative forms of governance and to act against democratic platforms to take on certain policies precisely because of certain urgencies. while others are also looking at this as an opportunity to challenge the status quo and begin to rethink questions of social justice precisely through the medium in which we're operating. I can't think that your leaderships have been immune to this kind of finagling and falsifications that happen between the fictions of architecture and the truths that emerge somehow in between them. But that if this is a new medium through which we're going to be communicating, that also includes the medium of power. And without the deanships and the leadership positions, in fact, there isn't some form of mediation between the voices that you would like represented and the other halls of power through which you're going to have to speak. So I'm just interested, as you wrap up, if you can share what is the difference in being a professor rather than being a leader who's had to balance out some very difficult things which have to do with the business model of these schools, with the balance of the role of architecture in institutions that are made up of many other programs, and the national politics that is beginning to encumber on your accessibility to maybe international students and your financial foundations. This is as important now at a global level as it is on the local.
That's a complex one, Nader. Lots of pieces. Maybe some of the things that Eva and Neil were referring to. You know, we are first a public institution, which of course the notion of the public has been redefined over many years, but also what that means as a public institution, like who has access to it. We've often been as public funding has been reduced and reduced and reduced, and public education is always tied to a particular geography. It's tied to a state, you know, and to funding that's coming from that state. And over the many years, as every public institution knows, the state funding has been diminishing over the years. So we always refer to ourselves as a privately funded public institution. And that has produced enormous challenges because as many deans know, in this country, fundraising ends up becoming 50% of your job, or a large portion of your job. And there is an entire group of people that you're responding to that operate on the other side of the academy, meaning that they are not the students, they are not the faculty and staff. They are not even necessarily the general public, but they are the boards. They are alumni, but it's a very different model. And I think that when we talk about globalizing the idea of public education, that's something that I think the notion of the digital world enables us to do in a way that we might not have ever been able to do otherwise. And we really need to think about what that means, because it is about moving outside of the notion of nation states, you know, or the states themselves, et cetera, and to think what that could look like and what that could be. I mean, we have certain things operating within our own institution that enable an in-state student, that a family that has under $30,000, that earns under $30,000, can come free to the university and also get their housing, et cetera. And anyone, a family under $80,000 can get their tuition free. And that was sort of set up by the university to somehow tie back to this notion of what the public university was supposed to be. But of course, that doesn't make my job any easier within this context, because we have to somehow figure out how we absorb that, and absorb that within a context of tenure and academic freedom for faculty. You know, so we have value systems that are operating in opposition to each other. And I also think that that affects the idea of how we think about power in relation to leadership. And I think it's interesting to me within the context of what's been happening on the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement and many others, because this is also a time of the crisis of politics and the idea of representation within the political sphere, right? People are demanding of their leaders or of their political leaders, because those demands refer back to the idea of representation, that there is somebody that I put into power that somehow is going to represent my ideas and represent my values. And what's happening, and what I had said in my response to our call for action letter, the change happens not by what we demand of others, but rather by what we demand of ourselves, because we actually have to change the model. If it's really about changing the structures and the hierarchies, then that also changes the way we think about power and our own responsibilities in this. So part of my response was to say that power has to be something that is shared, and that sharing of power is also the sharing of responsibility of our students as students and citizens, of our faculty, staff, of our larger community, but that every single person needs to be asking themselves, what does this mean? What does this demand of them? You know, because if we really want to talk about changing those hierarchies and those structures, that's what it's going to take, rethinking. And that rethinking has to happen through the system. Thank
you, Ayla. In many ways, that is a perfect place to wrap up, and a great response also to Hashim's prompt about representation. Neil, I want to thank you for the opportunity to bring us all together. And of course, Ayla and Eva, as always, I'm indebted to you for joining us on this, and I hope before long we can meet in person, and I can practice my cooking on you after my 4 months of practice. So thank you, and we'll be in touch very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.